Good evening, everybody. On behalf of the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies, or MEMS, at the University of Kent, I'd like to welcome all of you to our 2021 Chaucer Lecture. My name is Emily Gary, and Rory Loughnane and I are the co-directors of MEMS. While we wish we could host this lecture in person in Canterbury, we're thrilled to see so many people attending our virtual event tonight. Before we begin, I want to clarify a few Zoom housekeeping things. First, in order to avoid interruptions, we're going to have all attendees on mute throughout the talk. We will be sure to allow you to unmute and ask questions, and there will be plenty of time for questions at the end of the paper. You can use the raised hand button to signal that you have a question, or you can use the chat box to ask your question, and the chairs will be sure to keep our eyes on the chat. Now, to officially introduce tonight's talk, I'm going to hand over to my wonderful colleague, Ryan Perry, who just celebrated his birthday. Over to you, Ryan.
Thanks very much for that, Emily. And it's really magnificent to see such an international audience and filled with so many names that I know well. Welcome to the MEMS Chaucer lecture, and imagine yourself with us in Canterbury. I hope that all of us are in Canterbury in spirit for the Chaucer lecture. So it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Sebastian Sobecki, to give this year's Chaucer lecture. And to give a full list of all his publications and accolades would be long indeed. So I'm going to give an abbreviated version, but it still manages to be extraordinarily impressive. So Sebastian, of course, is Professor of Medieval English Literature and Culture in the University of Groningen. His alma mater is the University of Cambridge before he went on to become an assistant professor at McGill University, from whence he then migrated to Groningen. He's received many prestigious fellowships, including from Yale University, Allsou's College, Oxford, from the Huntingdon Library, and is a past recipient of the John Hurt Fisher Prize from the John Gower Society. He's about to take up a fellowship in Magdalen College, Oxford, in which he plans to further his research into his latest monograph, more of which anon. Sebastian has made a number of really extraordinary discoveries in his career to date. He identified John Gower's autograph hand. He's found a letter written for Marjorie Kemp's son, located rebels linked to Piers Plowman. He revealed the author of the earliest English description of Poland, and he's demonstrated really fascinating connections between tax records and the general prologue to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. He's published an incredible volume of work to date. In addition to a range of essays in leading journals, he's published 3 monographs. Last Words, The Public Self and the Social Author in Late Medieval England in 2019. Unwritten Verities, The Making of England's Vernacular Legal Culture, 1463 to 1549. And The Sea and Medieval English Literature, published in 2008. He's also produced 4 editions of primary texts: Medieval English Travel, a critical anthology, which he edited with Anthony Bale, an edition of Miles Hogarth's A Mirror of Misery, 1557, which is currently in press, and the first 2 volumes of a 14-volume edition of Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, which is also in press. And this is going to include 70 of the medieval narratives and documents that were printed by Hakluyt. He's currently also editing a substantial literary history, Global Medieval Travel Writing, a literary history, and that's going to come out with Cambridge University Press. How he has had time to do all that, I do not know. He's currently at, Sebastian's brand of research recommended him to us at MEMS as someone to deliver the Chaucer lecture. We saw him as being an especially apt person. We hoped for him to come to Canterbury, and we hope to have him in Canterbury actually in the autumn. But obviously today he's going to deliver it via Zoom. And the reasons that we saw him as being a particularly apt speaker is that MEMS is initially it's a cross-period centre, so we want our students to be comfortable working on medieval and early modern sources, and this is something that's absolutely true of our speaker today. And the mark of MEMS and the training that we provide here is about its interdisciplinarity. We want our students to be as comfortable looking at documents as at literary texts, and at material things too, as they bring different forms of evidence together in the creation of an argument. And again, that's something that absolutely is the stamp of Sebastian's exciting brand of research. Sebastian's next authored book is to centre on late medieval London, and this times were part of the great explosion in production of vernacular literature in the 14th and 15th centuries, and particularly in England's great metropolis. And I believe we're going to get some glimpses into his thoughts on this project today. So can I ask you to welcome and give a Zoom round of applause for today's speaker as he presents Inner Circles, Reading and Writing in Late Medieval London. Over to you, Sebastian.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much for this kind invitation. I wanted to thank Rory, Emily, and Ryan for extending this invitation to me in the first place. It's a real honor and a true delight to be giving this year's Chaucer lecture at Kent. Just want to make sure that you can see my slides. So, Ryan, if you could just, because I can't see it at this stage, if you could just say that.
I can, yes.
Good, fine.
Well.
So my talk borrows its title from a book project, which is part of my larger effort to study the production and consumption of written culture in late medieval London. Put simply, I argue that literature in London was generated, copied, and read in small circles that were not so much primarily defined by shared cultural tastes or socioeconomic traits, but by professional and devotional communities of practice. By literature, I mean manuscript text that did not perform a specific institutional function. Well, my definition of London comprises the city as well as Westminster, Southwark, and nearby religious houses organically tied to the capital. These communities of practice, in turn, shaped London's multiple literary cultures, from handwriting styles over thematic choices to formal expectations, including genre and mode. My model holds implications both for textual study and literary hermeneutics. It complicates received assumptions about the relationship between copyists and authors and the size and composition of their primary audiences. My hope is to nudge us away from both clubby coteries and grand aristocratic audiences, such as the one captured by the opulent Troilus frontispiece. This idyllic scene belongs to the literary apotheosis of Chaucer in the 15th century, a byproduct of Thomas Hopleaf and John Lydgay's anxiety of influence. Yet the frontispiece continues to be a low-hanging fruit for rushed student essays and derivative op-eds, aided by the spurious claim that Chaucer performed the Canterbury Tales for the first time on 17th April 1397 and in front of none other than Richard II. The OED editor Jonathan Dent spotted that for a number of consecutive years, several reputable news outlets were running the story on 17th April. His digging turned up that the source was an anonymous prankster who had vandalized the Wikipedia entry for the year 1397. So much for court performances. But let's start with the broader historical conditions for London's literary culture. As a long arc of David Wallace's literary history of late medieval Europe demonstrates, the explosive growth of European literary culture in the 14th and 15th centuries was unprecedented as an urban phenomenon. Ingeniously organized by trade routes, Wallace's book is actually not a literary history of Europe, but of Europe's cities. The concentration of aristocratic tastes, mercantile capital, and political power, and the presence of civic, ducal, royal, or imperial chanceries accelerated the development of literary production in Europe's urban hubs, including Budapest, Cologne, Cracow, Danzig, London, Naples, Nuremberg, Paris, and Prague, to name a few. Cities began to emerge as ideological and literary powerhouses. Central to this transformation were civil servants, commercial scribes, and ecclesiastical clerks. In London, the hub for this activity was the city of Westminster and the area around Rolls House and Chancery Lane. And you can see here in this engraving by Wenceslaus Holler, there are these three large structures, essentially medieval structures that would have been present in the 14th and 15th century. So we have the Abbey and Westminster Hall, both of which are still standing. And on the left, where it says Parliament House, this would have been St. Stephen's Chapel, which still was used as a royal chapel. The parliamentary use was only later in the 16th century, but of course that building no longer stands. And it's Westminster Hall here, right in the center, that was the seat of this activity. It was home to the courts of Chancery, Exchequer, Common Pleas, and King's Bench. In addition, council and privy clerks usually also worked in the hall or in the palace, as did clerks from the secretarial and administrative sides of Chancery, though most of the latter group were based in Rolls House. London's clerks and scriveners, many if not most of whom moved with ease between English, French, and Latin within the specialized vocabularies of their lines of work, labored in professional communities of practice, which I believe played a significant role in disseminating written and literary culture. Research into the work of this highly literate class has begun to transform our knowledge of the context for English literary culture and book production. Catherine Kirby Fulton's forthcoming book on the clerical proletariat and the resurgence of medieval English literature promises to be one such milestone. While the tantalizing suggestion that the poet and Privy Seal clerk Thomas Hopleaf and the professional scrivener Adam Pinkhurst were involved in the copying and editing of the works of Geoffrey Chaucer, John Gower, and William Langland has been hotly debated over the last 15 years. But these debates, some of which remain unresolved, have only emphasized how paleography has become an indispensable Hilfswissenschaft. In Vincent Gillespie's words, a highly detailed and finessed form of material and cultural history. These developments have thrown open vital research questions. Were London's civic, national, and commercial administrative centers involved in the production of literary manuscripts? Which of its urban settings or institutions can be identified as hubs of literary activity? Can comprehensive, empirical analysis of the capital scribal output reveal the extent to which bureaucratic, commercial, and ecclesiastical scribes shaped England's intellectual culture and the tastes of the reading public in the city and the country's regions? Much of the capital's vast archive of administrative records and literary manuscripts is waiting to be studied in a connected up way. To my mind, 4 distinct yet overlapping areas of vibrant research are especially pertinent, each of which I shall briefly outline. Late medieval English government and city records have been the domain of institutional, political, legal, and civic historians, such as Caroline Barron, John Baker, Martha Carlin, and John Watts. Whereas historians of diplomatic, that is the study of the form of historical records, have focused on the style and purpose of document categories, an area still dominated by the late Pierre Chaplet. Legal and institutional historians have generated biographies of individual clerks and their professional and social networks, covering the main government writing offices. Parliamentary histories and targeted studies have supplied additional information on the lives of these clerks. Civic, commercial, and ecclesiastical scribes have been treated in many dedicated studies. However, the prosopography of urban scribes and clerks remains incomplete, and individual clerks have been only rarely matched with scribal hands. Second, there is the study of language varieties and multilingualism. Historians, especially Willem Dodd and the late Mark Ormrod, have examined the relationship between the 3 administrative languages and the production of documents, while literary paleographers have shown how the same scribe may vary certain features of their script when switching languages. At the same time, manuscript specialists and historical linguists have drawn attention to English dialectal features in scribal identification. Wendy Scase's digital projects on the Vernon manuscript and West Midlands texts have opened up patterns of regional vernacular literacy. Historical linguists have also turned to administrative writing. Laura Wright has shed light on the relationship between London's multilingualism and the standardization of English, while the Stavanger MEST research program, notably its corpus of Middle English local documents, uses non-linguistic evidence to reconstruct the variety of linguistic usages current in documents produced in various regional centers, even allowing for scribal immigration. Michael Benskin's work on the language of government clerks has begun to correct earlier reductive assumptions of linguistic standardization around a variant of London English called Chancery Standard, otherwise known as Type 4 Middle English, and its presumptive influence on the development of modern English. A considerable number of recent publications have drawn attention to the trilingual nature of medieval England's intellectual culture. The ability to operate in written French, Latin, and English has been studied in connection with some Westminster clerks, including Hopleaf. Third, the study of medieval British handwriting is divided into experts working on literary text in Middle English and far fewer historians of diplomatic, concentrating on Latin and administrative forms of French. As a result, the nomenclature in use in late medieval English paleography is contested, with competing taxonomies existing side by side. Historians and paleographers trained on the continent or in North America tend to use either the system developed by Gerard Isaac Liefdink or a variation thereof by Julian Brown, further refined by Michel Brown. Given the specificity of some types of English script, in particular the style named Anglicana by Neil Kerr and extended to a family of scripts by Malcolm Parkes, many British historians and the majority of scholars of Middle English paleography follow the system formulated by Parkes in his groundbreaking book, English Cursive Bookhands, 1250 to 1500. Recent attempts by Albert Devollet to reconcile Parkes' terminology with a modified Liefdink model have not met with broad acceptance. The various Liefdinkian systems have a high number of gradations of documentary scripts, though they generally do not succeed at capturing all features particular to insular scripts, whereas Parkes concentrates on scripts used for manuscript books, paying less attention to administrative writing. As I have recently argued, neither system is aware of the fine yet firm grades and differences in the secretary script, prototypical of various English writing offices. The role of the secretary family of scripts is particularly important in telling the story of literary and administrative writing in late medieval London, and there is much need for an accurate, nuanced, and workable system for classifying the main cursive and business hands. So I meant cursive book and business hands, I'm sorry. While existing models for the dating of records rely on internal evidence and traditional paleographical estimations about changes in scripts, digital paleography offers exciting new prospects. I'm preparing a project that will use artificial intelligence and machine learning to evaluate all the information on the page so as to identify scribal hands and express their similarity in terms of probability. With the help of this quantitative approach, I eventually hope to process a considerable volume of documents and manuscripts to map London's literary and documentary production. Although we do possess important paleographical studies for groups of clerks for earlier periods or different regions of England, until recently no such work did exist for 14th and 15th century government and city scribes, despite Thomas Frederick Tout's early appeal for interdisciplinary collaboration between historians and literary scholars on these clerks. With the exception of Thomas Hopleaf and the occasional government clerk, individual hands remain obscure, and very little substantial research exists for the secretarial and administrative side of Chancery, the largest of all the writing offices in England, with 80 or so clerks at any given moment. Greater still was the number of the clerks working for the 4 central law courts. Civic scribes have fared far better, certainly since Lynn Mooney linked the professional scrivener Adam Pinkhurst with literary manuscripts, including copies of Chaucer's works. This trend includes Mooney and Estelle Stubbs's study of the Guildhall as a context for literary production, though the paleographical case for connecting Pinkhurst to the Guildhall remains tenuous. Works of the leading poets, including Chaucer, Gower, and Langland, were frequently copied in London circles, with 11 such manuscripts attributed to Scribe D, and the Scribe of Huntington, Library MS 114, is linked to the Guildhall and Goldsmiths. Mooney and Stubbs's identifications of both scribes with specific Guildhall clerks, Scribe D with John Merchant and the Huntington 114 scribe with Richard Osborne, have met with objections, most notably from Lawrence Warner. Furthermore, a scribe working for the Brewers Company was behind a manuscript containing a copy of Piers Plowman, while John Cock, a brother at St. Bartholomew's Hospital, copied several manuscripts. Two important commercial scribes have also been identified: the trilingual Richard Francis, who copied documents and literary texts, and Richard Frampton, who wrote out the Register of the Duchy of Lancaster and several Middle English books. And to share a recent find with you, Beinecke Library, Takamiya 61, a trilingual medical and alchemical miscellany, was at one stage owned and probably partly assembled by Thomas Highwood, a city scrivener. Over 3 leaves, we can see how Highwood developed his paraph, signature, and wording in preparation for his 1453 oath in the Scriveners' Company common paper. And you can see his signature down here at the bottom, Thomas Highwood with his paraph. And you can see at various stages on both folios how Highwood is being tried out in various configurations. And there are approaches to this and also to his paraph on the previous folios. Hopleaf once again tops the charts, with Mooney ascribing more than 100 documents to him and Helen Killick another 900. There is consensus that Hopleaf contributed to the production of literary manuscripts, though the exact extent of his involvement is under discussion. Misty Shibboleth's sensational 2018 discovery of Hopleaf's hand in the literary manuscript, British Library Harley 219, is a significant breakthrough, and has allowed me to show that the remaining hands in this manuscript also belong to Privy Seal clerks. And here you can see Hopleaf's hand on the left. The hand on the right, I believe, is that of his Privy Seal colleague, John Offord. Though the word d'Angleterre is inserted twice here in Hopleaf's hand. Furthermore, I've been able to identify the hand of the poet and signet clerk, George Ashby, arguing that he wrote out the autograph copy of his poem, The Active Policy of a Prince. Sporadic attributions have been made to the Privy Seal and later council clerk, Robert Fry, mainly by Pierre Chaplet, who first identified his hand. I have located Fry's handwriting in a number of other records and manuscripts, including most of British Library, Cotton Cleopatra F3, the so-called first part of the Book of the Council, and Edinburgh University Library, Manuscript 183, a Privy Seal formulary, which you can see here. And what's characteristic for Fry is this sort of elegant small module, the looped descenders, which you can see here in the final line, and his sort of really signal F signature on the bottom. On folio 154 verso, that's the image on your right-hand side, Fry copies the opening 6 lines of the French Alexander romance, Les Vœux de Pan. This is significant evidence, I think, for the cultivation of literary interest at the Privy Seal office in the late 14th century. When this was written, Hopleaf was a junior clerk in his 20s, whereas the senior clerks included Fry and Guy de Roucliffe, who bequeathed to Hopleaf a manuscript on the Trojan War and who sold the manor to John Gower. I have recently also identified the hands of some 30 other clerks of the Privy Seal, Signet and Council, and the King's French secretaries. Except for sporadic case studies, clerks working for the law courts and religious institutions have not been systematically investigated. Other clerical and commercial scribes have emerged elsewhere as forces shaping literary culture in the capital and beyond. A term borrowed by manuscript studies from anthropology, a community of practice is an aggregate of people who come together in mutual engagement in an endeavor, as defined by Penelope Eckert and Sally McConnell-Ginet. Westminster clerks, London's commercial scriveners, and scribes working in civic and religious institutions formed intellectual communities of practice, sharing educational backgrounds, working cultures, and literary tastes. These communities of practice were both functional and geographic, each occupied a specific location or locations in Greater London. Such communities could also center on parishes or the devotional practices of a group of people linked through professional or familial ties. A good example of this is Ryan Perry's Whittington's Gift Project, based here at Kent, dedicated to understanding how John Carpenter, common clerk of the city and Mayor Richard Whittington's executor, put the Guildhall Library at the center of new pastoral models that were used for religious books. And the mercantile readers and consumers of these books certainly formed what I would call a community of practice. And there is more. Historians have begun to unravel the deep-running ties between the city's religious houses and their literate parishioners. My own research has benefited from this, allowing me to show that Hopleaf's Privy Seal colleague and benefactor John Bailey wished to be buried in the Carmelite priory in the neighborhood in which both he and Hopleaf lived. A first exploration of wills and these religious houses indicates that clerks who worked together often wished to be buried together. Each professional community of practice came with its set of formal expectations for and of writing, the document type and function, the subtype of script use, or the conditions under which work took place. Some communities consisted of a single episcopal secretary with an underclerk. Others saw multiple individuals execute writing in the same location. The largest of these groups undoubtedly being the many clerks toiling for the four law courts crowded into Westminster Hall. And this is the scene that Hopleaf's Thomas faces in the complaint during his frequent ordeal in this place as he passes through a throng of law clerks before reaching the small group of colleagues in the Privy Seal corner. Vooraf toen hij in Westminster Hall en ik in Londen among the place went, I see the chair baten and a pile of hem that want me for to call to company. Her head they cast away, Juan I hem met, as they not may see. Sometimes writing was minimal and ad hoc, minutes and attendance taken at council gatherings, law recording in courts, or the formulaic numerical record keeping during mercantile transactions. Some settings prioritize writings, others reading or both. The diversity of settings in which writing took place came with varying levels of literacy. A merchant or controller did not need to be able to read or write verse to balance ledgers. This was not unlike our command of Latin. Modern understanding, our modern command of this language is almost always amounts to passive knowledge. Our knowledge of Latin is a purposive and highly grammaticalized form of literacy with a focus on translation, underpinned by bookish parsing for case, tense, mood, flexion, declination, and parts of speech. In this sense, medieval London's communities of practice were specialized silos, often existing in close geographic proximity to one another. Yet these silos were permeable to a certain extent, and contact between them did take place. They were also multilingual, some operating in 2 or even 3 languages. Here, as with so much else in medieval Europe, from currencies and units of measurements to dialects and regulations, local variation was more prevalent than any centralized impulse. And multiplicity rather than unity was the central episteme and guiding principle. In London, there was not one, but many literary cultures. This does not mean that there were no overlaps. Texts sometimes moved between communities of practice, though such movement was often associated with geographical relocation, such as when a provincial clerk or a team of clerks accompanied a bishop or ecclesiastical dignitary on the taking up of an appointment in or near London. And these strike me as some of the likeliest conditions explaining the copying of provincial, especially alliterative literature in London. One does not simply move to medieval London and start writing there. My research response to Lawrence Warner's call for what he calls a comprehensive history of the textual production of the late medieval metropolis. And my argument inserts itself between 2 important existing book-length studies, Ralph Hanna's London Literature, 1300 to 1380, and Julia Boffey's Manuscript and Print in London, circa 1475 to 1530. The intervening century, from 1380 to 1475, hasn't received in recent years a study dedicated to London literature, even though this period covers the activity of some of the most frequently studied medieval English writers with London ties, including Chaucer, Gower, Hopleaf, and Lydgate. What's more, the same period covers the most productive stretch for the copying of Middle English literary manuscripts. At the same time, this chronological gap coincides with the full life cycle of the Lancastrian dynasty, from the removal of Richard II to the arrival of the first Tudor monarch in 1485. Institutionally speaking, the century couched between Hanna's and Boffey's studies witnessed important continuities, among them 60 years of uninterrupted Lancastrian rule that would shape and cement the professional patterns and cultural rituals of London's communities of practice. An important impulse for my argument lies embedded in Hanna's rationale for closing his study of London literature in or around 1380. For Hanna, this date marks what he calls the temporal confluence of 3 widely acknowledged revolutions. Primary is, of course, the appearance of the canonical English national tradition, new Chaucerian literature, the Parliament of Fowls in 1381, Troilus in 1386. These productions are contemporary with Samuels's postulated demise of an older variety of written London English, type 2, and the appearance of a new sort, is type 3 Chaucerian English, first recorded in the writings of Thomas Usk and in the London Guild Returns of 1389. Finally, the very writing system changed at this moment. Just after 1375, a new variety of bookhand, secretary, appears in English literary manuscripts. These three revolutions, then, were transformations of a literary, linguistic, and paleographical kind, each one a dominant trait of London literature in the long century from Richard II to Henry VII. Yet all three could be said to reflect the capital's emerging communities of practice, sourcing their energies from specific administrative and cultural configurations in Westminster, Southwark, and London. As for the new Chaucerian literature, I have argued that Chaucer's 1380s and 1390s works were written for specific small audiences, the earlier of the two being a circle of civic administrators to whom both Chaucer and Thomas Usk belonged, the later to a group of scriveners and clerks based in Southwark. The linguistic shift Hannah detects is driven by administrative standardization, though not along the artificially neat lines John Fisher once proposed. Instead, it was the combined scribal clout and authority, I contend, of the royal scriptory of the Signet in Windsor and Westminster's Privy Seal Office that established London's prestige forms of Middle English. The fact that these forms then molded the language of many of the literary manuscripts of the 15th century is itself a powerful argument for the role, direct or indirect, of London clerks in the production of London literature. The third shift, the arrival of the secretary script, may strike some of us as somewhat incidental, Kabbalistic even. However, I would maintain that it is the most remarkable of the three, and it speaks eloquently to the power of London's institutional communities of practice. In the third quarter of the 14th century, clerks serving on England's campaigns in France rapidly assimilated the continental script now classified in the Leafting system as cursiva or cursiva recentior, referred to in English as secretary. English clerks borrowed the French forms of this family of scripts, formalized in the 15th century by writing masters as lettres de minute, lettres bâtardes, and lettres courantes. And you can see all three examples here in a celebrated manuscript by an anonymous French writing master, sometimes attributed to Robert of Tours. You can see the smallest module on the left of the lettres de minute, your sort of standard variety of secretary. Then you have the larger bookhand, very stylish versions of which have produced the deluxe manuscript of the lettres bâtardes, and then the bigger module, a presentation script really of the lettres courriel or the court hand. The arrival of secretary in England was transformative. On just about every level, this script made sense. All of a sudden, English missives looked fashionable and thus tactful. The cursivity of the script increased administrative productivity and written output. The secretary script was the ox-drawn heavy plough of the late medieval bureaucracy. Given the scriptural status accorded to Malcolm Parkes's English cursive bookhands, 1250 to 1500, Anglicana has become the main and at times sole interest of specialists in English literature. Its elegant, upright variant, Anglicana formata, the original Anglicana for Neil Kerr, remains frozen in time as the quintessence of the ambitious late medieval poem. And when I think about the prototypical Middle English manuscript, my mind inevitably conjures up the Ellesmere or Hanged Canterbury Tales, or one of the equally sort of sumptuous copies of its chic contemporary Gower's Confessio Amantis. And yet, of the 85 complete and partial manuscript copies of the Canterbury Tales, only 36 are crafted in the form of Anglicana, whereas 39 are written in secretary, with some 10 copies either mixed or written in hybrid hands. Secretary hands are also prominent among the generally more exclusive manuscript of the Confessio, of which 49 have survived. 13 are written in secretary or include a secretary hand among them, and a further 9 are hybrid hands. And I'm grateful to Lynn Mooney for these figures. These proportions may be a function of time as secretary edges out Anglicana as a bookhand, particularly after the advent of print, which allowed typesetters to reach straight for the upper shelf of textura at no extra cost, leapfrogging Anglicana formata. Perhaps the early loser following the arrival of print was not manuscript culture per se, as Elizabeth Eisenstein had once proclaimed, but Anglicana formata and handwritten forms of upright, elaborate scripts. Secretary was the cursive script par excellence and went on to dominate early modern document and letterhands. It could certainly hold its own against italic scripts for a long time. Medieval England's secretary script not only had a number of grades, roughly corresponding to its French equivalents, but various communities of practice developed their own distinct forms of the script. In England, too, secretary was not a script, but a family of scripts. The variety used by the Privy Seal office differed from the form employed by the signet. The kind used by the king's French secretaries, who were French themselves, was altogether different. So what does this mean for clerks' involvement in the production of literary manuscripts? For one, we need to study manuscripts and documents side by side, by community of practice, defined among other by script type, document, mise en page, and language variety. For example, if I wanted to identify the scribes of accomplished literary manuscripts written in Anglicana formata, then I would start by looking at the biggest of all the writing offices, Chancery, or the 4 law courts, all of which exclusively used bespoke forms of Anglicana. Most chancery and legal records were written in draft or informal grades of Anglicana. Certain formal documents or charters under the Great Seal, which was issued by the chancery, were executed in varieties of Anglicana formata, that is, this accomplished bookhand that you find in so many Middle English presentation copies. And we certainly know the chancery clerks owned literary manuscripts. In his will of 1419, Richard Southworth left his fellow chancery clerk John Stoppenden Quendam Librum Meum de Canterbury Tales. The more time one spends with documentary scribes, the easier it becomes to identify a type of script by community of practice. And the best yields come from manuscripts with a number of similar hands, such as Harley 219. All of the 15 hands in this codex are Privy Seal hands, whereas Edinburgh 183, the Privy Seal formulae I mentioned earlier, shows predominantly Privy Seal secretary and some Chancery Anglicana hands. And you can see here on the left, the hand of Robert Fry, and on the right, a Chancery hand, but the marginal remarks are again, or headings, are in Fry's hand. And he is the one who oversaw this formulary. Oxford Bodleian Library, Ashmore 789, which contains a formulary portion, has Privy Seal and signet hands, some of which can now be attributed to known clerks. For instance, the formulary letter, this formulary letter is written in the hand of the former signet and later Privy Seal clerk John Offord, a colleague of Hopleaf's. In Ashmore 789, Offord writes in the draft version of the same fine secretary hand he employs when copying the French Secretum Secretorum in Harley 219, which you can see on the right hand. The literary manuscript, and that's from the literary manuscript most likely supervised by Hopleaf. The marginal comments are in his informal secretary hand, with its characteristic Privy Seal coat hanger G. This is Offord, not Hopleaf. Another hand in Ashmore 789 is that of the illustrious Richard Cordray, Henry V's secretary while in France, clerk of the council until 1435, chancellor of Cambridge University, and later dean of St. Martin le Grand. And you wonder that he would still be writing his own documents. I identified his hand on the basis of 2 records penned while accompanying Henry V in France during his time as the king's secretary. The first is a letter with his signature, but the second is a personal plea to the king to spare the population of Paris in the wake of the 1420 Treaty of Troyes, and, just as importantly, a reminder to tell the king that Cordray has come into the possession of, and I read out the last line there, a book of Ptolemy that I, Cordray, wrote to you of, adding that the Duke of Berry will keep this book for Henry. And this entirely overlooked letter is one of those rare glimpses that allows us to see how the Royal Library was stocked during the 100 Years' War and how French books flowed across the Channel. Cordray, too, may have had a hand in impressing his community of practice on literature. I have argued that on stepping down from the council in 1435 and becoming the secretary of John Holland, Admiral of England, Cordray composed the Libel of English Policy, whose bureaucratic poetry never attempts to conceal its author's day job. And if you will more of Calais, here and Knoll, he cast to wit within a little scroll, like as he have done before and B&B in other parties of Ur Policier. Both Cordray and Offord were in France in 1420 and from 1420 to 1422 with Henry V, and the formulary portion of Ashmore 789, and perhaps even more of the Codex, may have originated there, perhaps while copying French missives to fill the vacant hours between assignments. The stratification of script by community of practice has other implications too. There is no evidence, to my mind, to support the frequently repeated assertion that a professional clerk, that is a scribe who predominantly made a living by writing, was able to master both secretary and Anglicana scripts. Actually, they couldn't have. Although Orietta Darold has shown in her discussion of cursive scripts and paper as a writing surface that absolute distinctions between amateur and professional do not hold, there remains a difference between an accomplished hand rendering a single script over years of practice in a specific work environment and writers who wrote in less structured or stable settings, or who wrote for purposes other than to support themselves through their writing. A community of practice, whether centered on a national writing office or an episcopal chancery, used one type of script only, or if the institution was sufficiently complex, its subdepartments each relied on one script. And when clerks moved during their professional lives, they usually did so geographically, moving with or within the same community of practice, or they were transferred to a similar setting. The latter was the case with many signet and privy seal clerks during the 1420s and 1440s while deployed to France. To achieve the required level of consistency and output that professional clerks were expected to attain, it was necessary to be trained over decades, usually from childhood. Emulation and repetition also helped to explain the slow rate of change in handwriting styles, as students copied their teachers. Here is the autograph hand of Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, at the age of 11, threatening from his impecunious exile in France to subdue rebels. He proudly adds that this letter is written in my own hand, that ye may see how good a writer I am. Young Edward writes in a signet variety of secretary that resembles the hand of George Ashby, his likely writing tutor. For 20 years, Ashby was always at the side of Queen Margaret, who kept Edward with her at all times. And Ashby was a poet, as we know. Hence, underclerks' hands resemble those of their superiors. Just as some scribes write like father, like son, the hand of George Ashby is echoed by that of his son John, and in turn by his grandson George II, a dynasty of signet clerks, training each other, with George Sr. probably also training his grandson. Many Westminster clerks hailed from all areas of England, as their wills tell us, yet ended up writing consistently in the same variety of English and the same script as their office required, even in their surviving private correspondence with their family. Such flawless consistency and internalized craftsmanship, to use a phrase that Daniel Wakeland has impressed on us, is attained by decades of repetition. The example par excellence is Trinity College, Cambridge, R32, an exemplar with which every student of Middle English will be familiar. Set against a daunting lineup of accomplished Anglicana formata scribes in this manuscript, one of whom you see on the left, scribe A, Hopleaf's brief intervention sticks out like a sore thumb, not because it is so brief, but because he is trying really, really hard to match the uprightness of the host script, only to look like a fish out of water with a secretary hand. Hopleaf was a seasoned Privy Seal clerk, handling Latin, French, and English writs, warrants, and missives, many of which needed to look presentable when finding their way into the hands of dignitaries, both foreign and domestic. If he did have an Anglicana hand up his sleeve, this would be the moment to play it. The fact that he doesn't, even though he pushes his bastard secretary to make it resemble Scribes A's Anglicana formata, it is not an achievement, but a hack job from a scribe's point of view. He wouldn't get away with this at work. And please don't get me wrong, I'm very partial to the almost handsome economy of the secretary script, a nimble, fleet-footed variety of Gothic handwriting. This was, after all, not just the script du jour in trend-setting 15th century France and Burgundy, but the visual idiom in which to address princes. Much the same can be observed in Hengert, where hand F exemplifies the difficulty of professional scribes to take the leap from secretary to Anglicana. Doyle and Parkes have tentatively identified hand F as Hopleaf, and Simon Harobin has made a strong case that hands C to E are also Hopleaf. I certainly concur that hands C to F belong to Privy Seal scribes, but to my mind, hand C could also be that of John Offord. I'm less persuaded by Doyle and Parkes' assertion that the changes on folio 83 verso and 138 verso, so the two images on the right-hand side, are necessarily in the same hand. To my mind, of these two, only 83 verso, upper right, is Hopleaf. However, neither Hopleaf nor any of the other Privy Seal hands in Hangard, if they were different hands indeed, could write Anglicana, because among the hundreds of documents and hundreds of folios that have survived in his hand, there is not a single line written in Anglicana, for the simple reason that he never needed to learn, much less master, a script that the Privy Seal wouldn't employ. The same holds true for other professional clerks, including Adam Pinkhurst. I therefore take a different view on script switching from Lynn Mooney, who asserts that, quote, like most late 14th and 15th century English scribes, Adam Pinkhurst could write a number of scripts, Anglicana or secretary, more or less formal, end quote. I don't necessarily disagree with the identification of Pinkhurst as the scribe of the Ellesmere and Hangard Canterbury Tales and certain other manuscripts. I think it is certainly plausible, if difficult to prove, because unlike his book hand, his document hand displays certain secretary forms characteristic for his community of practice. But I don't think we have examples of Pinkhurst writing in secretary proper. Anglicana scribes ran up against the same wall, but from the other side. Ralph Hanna notes how in the trilingual Trenton manuscript of Gower's poetry, the main hand, scribe 5, has a hard time making his Anglicana formata resemble the increasingly fashionable secretary hand when switching from a Latin poem to a French work. In Hanna's words, quote, he has a rather uneasy go of it. For nearly a full leaf at the point of transition, he consistently tries to convert his script from its Anglo-Latin Anglicana to his Anglo-Norman secretary forms, end quote. And you can see it here. On the left, he's writing in Latin with a regular Anglicana formata. On the right, he's trying to try out some stylish new forms. As you can see, the single compartment G, which I'll just circle here. And he's trying to make it a little bit more tilted in aspect and angle. This would be a good time to write in a secretary hand, especially in a manuscript overseen and owned by Gower himself. Finally, there are substantial implications for authors and audiences. Hanna, in closing his argument in London Literature, remarks that the Chaucerianism of the late 14th century that effectively displaces earlier forms of literature in the capital, in particular romance, was, quote, strongly imbricated in a coterie romanaclée, end quote. This is where Hanna's narrative breaks off. And if one were to misunderstand roman à clé literally, then the obvious next step would be to pursue John Manley's generally debunked attempts at unveiling the historical individuals behind the pilgrims in the general prologue to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. But I would argue that the community Chaucer was writing for at this stage in his life was a local Southwark audience comprising civil servants and scriveners, and perhaps the odd fellow poets such as Gower. Caroline Barron suggested plausibly that Chaucer stayed in Southwark while he was clerk of the King's Works. And I have pointed out that Harry Bailey, the infamous host who inflicts himself on the travelling party, was in fact the controller of the 1381 poll tax for Southwark, the records of which have survived. The muddled and unconventional estate satire of the general prologue, its absence of the nobility, the excessive amount of pilgrims, the random order, and the long string of different professions do not appear in other estate satires, but they are all echoed in the poll tax roll for Southwark in 1381, chapped by Harry Bailey. That's why every Southwark resident knew Bailey, because he had knocked on every door. What's more, I have also shown that the then Southwark-based scrivener John Brinchley, who was the earliest known owner of a manuscript of the Canterbury Tales, was one of the assessors of the 1381 Southwark poll tax. And the stretch of Southwark's insalubrious waterside properties with their stews and brothels was known as the land of the Priory of Stratford at Bow, the religious house of the socialite prioress in the Canterbury Tales. The actual prioress of that priory was represented in London's Court of Hustings by Richard Forster, Chaucer's lawyer. His will, by the way, makes a very considerable bequest to the new Guildhall building. These in-jokes would be lost on anyone who wasn't a Southwark local or understood the finer points of counter rolls and record keeping. This first audience might also have included other clerks and scriveners such as Thomas Spencer, who, as Martha Cullen has revealed, probably owned a copy of Chaucer's Troilus. Whereas we now know that Chancery, Signet, Privy Seal, and Guildhall clerks and London scriveners owned manuscript copies of important literary works, the theory that any particular location was a central clearinghouse for London's literary manuscripts is difficult to sustain. Simon Harobin has recently argued that the process of producing manuscripts of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales does not suggest that this took place at the Guildhall at all. In response to my case for precisely such a professionally defined Southwark readership for the Canterbury Tales, Harobin writes that, quote, "It is easy to imagine copies of individual tales circulating amongst that readership. Such copies could have formed the basis for the manuscripts that now survive, thereby explaining the considerable variety in their contents, tale order, and textual affiliations. It seems more likely that the copyists responsible were drawn from this group of readers and professional scribes rather than from a centralized office like the London Guildhall," end quote. The diversity and stratification of London's many communities of practice offers a robust model for understanding not only the dissemination of literature in the capital, but also the intimate enmeshing of author, audience, and copyist. It is the very intimacy of these professional communities of practice that takes us back to Hopleaf and his inner circle of Privy Seal and Westminster clerks. Ethan Knapp and David Watt have shown that Hopleaf's series was written for an in-the-know Westminster audience. My own inquiries have brought to light his colleague's will, with bequests to Hopleaf and his wife, including property once owned by Hopleaf in the Bedfordshire village of Hopleaf. Studying the same circle has turned up a letter from John Offord, Hopleaf's fellow Privy Seal clerk, whose name appears in the margins of the Durham holograph of the series, and who, together with Bailey, Hopleaf, and a third colleague, is mentioned in the equally intimate Ballad to Summer, apparently a Court of Good Company production. And we've seen Offord's hand already a few times today. This letter, I argue, is actually addressed to Hopleaf, and I will publish this later this spring on the blog of the National Archives. More significantly, my research into the manuscript evidence confirms the authenticity of the framework narrative in Hopleaf's series. I can now show that the very copy of the Gesta Romanorum, which Thomas admits to his friend is incomplete, has actually survived, corroborating the account given by the poet's textual alter ego. Hopleaf wrote for a bespoke audience he knew, and that audience knew him well too, a closed inner circle. Hopleaf collaborated with civic scribes and Westminster clerks on literary manuscripts. He owned personal copies, at least, of the Gesta Romanorum and the work on the Trojan War. He wrote out some of Chaucer's payment warrants and probably had a hand in determining the shape of the Canterbury Tales. With much of the city's literary culture still hidden and obscured, his silhouette keeps emerging in several places and contexts, whether as poet, editor, scribe, or publicist. If late medieval London's literary scene had a godfather, it was Thomas Hopleaf. Thank you.